What I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. For decades, Washington told the world that their interventions in Venezuela were about democracy, human rights, and freedom. For decades, Washington told the world that their interventions in Venezuela were about democracy, human rights, and freedom. But now, the Pentagon has finally admitted what military analysts have suspected for years. It was never about democracy. It was about one thing: oil. And more importantly, protecting the dollar. In the next 15 minutes, you're going to discover exactly what the Pentagon just revealed. Why Venezuela sits on the world's largest oil reserves, and how this admission exposes the true reason behind America's decades-long economic warfare against Caracas. Stay until the end, because what's happening right now between Venezuela, China, and Russia could reshape the entire global financial system. Let's decode this. Let's start with the bombshell itself. Recent Pentagon documents and high-ranking military officials have begun acknowledging what was previously considered conspiracy theory, that U.S. policy toward Venezuela has been fundamentally driven by energy security and dollar hegemony, not democratic concerns. Former Pentagon advisors and defense strategists have openly discussed how Venezuela's 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world, represent a strategic asset that Washington could not allow to fall under the control of adversarial powers. But here's where it gets even more explosive. Venezuela didn't just have oil. Venezuela made a decision that directly threatened the foundation of American economic power. They began selling oil in currencies other than the U.S. dollar. This is called a de-dollarization, and it's the one thing that Washington fears more than any military threat. You see, the U.S. dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is built on one critical foundation: oil. Since the 1970s, virtually all global oil transactions have been conducted in U.S. dollars. This system, known as the petrodollar, forces every country in the world to hold massive dollar reserves just to buy energy. When Venezuela announced it would accept payment in yuan, euros, and even cryptocurrencies, they weren't just making an economic decision. They were declaring war on the petrodollar system itself. And the Pentagon knew exactly what that meant. Now let's talk about why Venezuela matters so much strategically. Venezuela sits on the Orinoco Belt, the single largest petroleum deposit on planet Earth. We're talking about more oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, more than Iraq and Iran combined. 303 billion barrels. At current consumption rates, that's enough oil to power the entire world for over 8 years. But here's the critical detail that mainstream media never tells you. Venezuela's oil is heavy crude, the same type that American refineries in Texas and Louisiana were specifically designed to process. When Venezuelan oil stopped flowing to the United States due to sanctions, those refineries had to import heavy crude from Russia instead. Yes, you heard that correctly. American sanctions on Venezuela actually increased U.S. dependence on Russian oil. The irony is almost impossible to believe. Now, the Pentagon has acknowledged that maintaining access to Venezuelan oil was always a core strategic objective. Not because America needs the oil, the U.S. is now a net energy exporter, but because they needed to control who else could access it. And that brings us to the real threat. While Washington was focused on sanctions and regime change operations, something far more significant was happening behind the scenes. China was moving in. Over the past 15 years, Beijing has invested over $60 billion in Venezuela, making it one of China's largest overseas investment destinations in the Western Hemisphere. Chinese state oil companies now have direct access to Venezuelan oil fields. Chinese construction firms have built critical infrastructure. And most importantly, China has been providing Venezuela with billions that are repaid in one currency, not dollars. Oil. This oil for loans arrangement completely bypasses the petrodollar system. Venezuela pumps oil directly to China, and China provides manufactured goods and technology and financial support in return. No dollars required. This is exactly the scenario that Pentagon strategists have identified as an existential threat to American economic hegemony. If other oil-producing nations follow Venezuela's model, and many are already considering it, the global demand for U.S. dollars would collapse. And with it, America's ability to finance its $34 trillion national debt. Let me explain why this matters. The United States currently runs massive budget deficits, spending far more than it collects in taxes. The only reason this is sustainable is because the entire world needs dollars to buy oil. Foreign countries buy U.S. Treasury bonds, they hold dollar reserves, they finance American debt. But if oil starts trading in yuan or euros or a new BRICS currency, that demand disappears, and America's economic model collapses. This is what the Pentagon actually fears about Venezuela. Not Maduro, not socialism, not human rights. They fear losing control of the petrodollar. But China isn't the only major power that has moved into Venezuela. Russia has established a significant military and economic presence in the country, providing everything from weapon systems to military advisors to billions in investment. Russian state oil company Rosneft acquired major stakes in Venezuelan oil projects. Russian military aircraft have conducted exercises in Venezuelan airspace. And Moscow has made it clear that any U.S. military intervention in Venezuela would be viewed as a direct threat to Russian interests. This creates what military strategists call strategic triangulation, where Russia and China both have vital interests in preventing U.S. control of Venezuelan oil. For the Pentagon, this transforms Venezuela from a regional problem into a global strategic challenge. Any military operation against Venezuela now risks confrontation with not one, but two nuclear-armed adversaries. This is why, despite all the rhetoric about regime change and intervention, the United States has ultimately relied on economic sanctions rather than military force. They know the risks, and now, with the Pentagon's implicit admission that this was always about oil and dollar hegemony, the strategic calculations are becoming even more complex. If military intervention was too risky, Washington turned to its other weapon of choice: economic warfare. Since 2017, the United States has imposed some of the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history against Venezuela. Oil exports were blocked, financial transactions were frozen, foreign companies were threatened with secondary sanctions if they did business with Caracas. The result? Venezuela's economy collapsed by over 75%. Hyperinflation reached millions of percent. Millions of Venezuelans fled the country as refugees. Washington called this maximum pressure, designed to force regime change by making the Venezuelan economy unlivable. But here's what the Pentagon's admission reveals about the true purpose of these sanctions. They weren't just trying to change the government. They were trying to destroy Venezuela's ability to function as an alternative to the petrodollar system. If Venezuela's oil for yuan deals with China succeeded, if Caracas could prove that a country could survive and even thrive while bypassing the dollar, it would inspire other nations to follow: Iran, Russia, Saudi Arabia, even traditional U.S. allies. The sanctions were designed to make Venezuela a warning to any country considering de-dollarization. This is what happens when you challenge the dollar. So where do we stand now? The Biden administration recently eased some sanctions on Venezuela, allowing Chevron to resume limited oil operations. But this wasn't done for humanitarian reasons. It was done because American refineries desperately need Venezuelan heavy crude, and the alternatives, Russian oil and Canadian tar sands, are either sanctioned or environmentally controversial. Meanwhile, Venezuela has continued expanding its relationships with China, Russia, and now the broader BRICS alliance. In fact, Venezuela has formally applied to join BRICS, the economic bloc that represents over 40% of global population, and is actively building alternatives to the dollar-dominated financial system. If Venezuela is accepted, and current indications suggest it will be, Caracas will gain access to the new development bank, alternative payment systems, and potentially the new BRICS currency that is currently being developed. This would effectively complete Venezuela's exit from the dollar system, and there's nothing Washington can do to stop it. What the Pentagon has admitted about Venezuela isn't just about one country or one oil supply. It's about the future of the global financial system itself. For 50 years, the petrodollar has been the foundation of American economic power. It allowed the United States to run endless deficits, maintain 800 military bases worldwide, and impose its will on any nation that challenged its interests. But that system is now under direct attack. Venezuela was just the beginning. China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and now dozens of countries in the global south are actively building alternatives to dollar hegemony. The Pentagon's admission about Venezuela reveals that Washington understands exactly what's at stake and exactly why they've fought so hard to maintain control. The question now is, can they succeed? Or is the petrodollar system already in terminal decline? That's what we'll be analyzing in upcoming videos. Subscribe animation. If you want to understand the geopolitical and economic forces reshaping our world, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an analysis. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening behind the headlines. And drop a comment below. What do you think this Pentagon admission means for the future of U.S. foreign policy? This is Conflict Decoded. We'll see you in the next one.